Okay, I think at this point, it would be helpful if we talk a little bit about what does it mean to do evangelism in the 21st century? Because I think that takes on a very different context than it did in the last century, in the 20th century. I know from my own perspective in my community of faith, one of the biggest challenges that we face with local congregations is when it comes to evangelism, the word evangelism, the E word, does not scare them, not in general. The biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges we face is that we have a 20th century mindset, or 20th century context of doing evangelism. And I think if we're going to continue to be effective for Christ's church in the 21st century, we have to bring we have to bring our evangelism into the 21st century. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, what does it mean to do evangelism in the 21st century? What does that look like? And maybe even more important than that, is evangelism an activity the church ought to be engaged in the 21st century? And if so, why? I like to share a story of my own about what one congregation, what evangelism looks like in their context. This is a congregation I've been working with now for 4 or 5 years, and when I first started working with them, had a very classic view of evangelism in the 20th century. And one of the first things I had to convince him of, because the whole reason I got to them is that they wanted to solidify their future. You know, they wanted to be a 21st century church. They wanted to, I mean, we're talking about a congregation that's over 100 years old, and they wanted to at some point to say, hey, we've been in the business of Christ for 200 years. Why do we do that? How do we reach that? And so that's how my relationship began with them. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is one of the things that I had to help them come to see is, okay, if we're going to do evangelism in a 21st century context, two things that we're gonna have to take seriously. One is we're gonna have a context for what vision is now and what that looks like. Okay, vision meaning long term, and then we have to have a context to what our mission is. Mission being short term, as we're moving toward our vision. To make a long story short, this is now a congregation that has taken mission in their community seriously. They're doing things now that they never would have 5 years ago. I mean, you could not have paid them to do some of the things that they're doing now. And it's about relationship. You know, it's about not come join us. It's about what can we do for you.
Susan called me about 10 months ago. She's a parishioner, to tell me that her next door neighbor, who they've got a good relationship with, that he had been in their backyard weeping because his marriage was falling apart. And Susan told me that she prayed with him, which sort of, really? That's cool. That's very cool, because Susan is very quiet. Faith is real for Susan, but you wouldn't guess she's not a Bible flogger by any means. And she called me because, not to get patted on the back, but to warn me that she told the next door neighbor, you really should talk to Peter. I'm sure he talked to you. You should talk to Peter. And about 12 minutes later, I got a phone call from the next door neighbor. Next door neighbor hasn't been in church in 20 years. Dropped out as a teenager. And for the last 10 months, he's been in church almost every Sunday. I think that's sort of what evangelism looks like in the 21st century. It's built on relationship. These two neighbors had relationship, had connection. The neighbor knew that Susan and her husband were people of faith, although they didn't have big signs, but they just knew they're people of faith. When he was in crisis, who do I go talk to? I go talk to my friends, my neighbor. My neighbor might have some faith connection. And the door opens. Susan saw an opportunity not to shove the gospel, but to say, I've got something I can give, care, I can pray with you. I think that's what evangelism looks like in the 21st century.
Good.
It's not about a program. And I'm not sure you can teach the Susans of the world in a workshop how to do that. It's as you go. It's part of living it. It's part of having this integrated into their lives.
So instead of us wanting them to come to us, we are going to them with our relationships, whatever those relationships may be, professional or otherwise. They are simply either a relative or a friend or a neighbor or a person you sit next to and get to know, that kind of thing. And it builds on a relationship rather than starting with an argument or with a judgment or something of that nature. It starts with the relationship. Is that what's different about the 20th century evangelism, that it built more on relationships than in the past? Or is it just the same thing?
Yeah, or an agenda. I want to add on an
Right.
agenda where my agenda is I want you to come
Right.
and join my church for whatever reason.
Exactly.
You know, I also think, Peter, I like that story because I think that gets right at it. But I also think that goes back to what Bruce said earlier and what Heather said earlier about the relationships. You said about come join us, you know, is that, and as Peter was talking, what came to my mind was for disciples now, this is just disciples, it may be true of other faith communities as well, but I can speak for disciples. Too many of our congregations still have the context of evangelism of knocking on doors, okay? And what you're talking about is very different, very, very different.
I think we talk about how to do it. I think we have to be grounded in our faith practices. We have to know the story in order to go out and tell the story. So I think we need to be grounded in Scripture, be grounded in our prayer lives, be grounded in service and those other faith practices so we know how to do it and why we're doing it is critical to me.
I think another thing that's changed in the 21st century is that is that because the institution of the church in the way that we've understood it is so vulnerable right now, that as we connect with others in relationship, the nature of our experience of church is going to change. And I think people know this kind of implicitly, and I think they're scared of that. And I think so the idea of actually being some kind of a transforming partner in someone's life is actually threatening to a lot of us, because it means that they might challenge us in our own experience of faith and life. And I think that's kind of, we probably don't talk about that, and most people we may not recognize it very readily, but I think there is kind of a sense that my own stability, my own faith, my own experience of church maybe will be vulnerable here, and I'm not sure that I'm strong enough for that. I'm not sure that I have the resources to deal with that vulnerability. And so how do we help folks not to fear, how to be confident in their faith and their hope, how to embrace the possibility of new forms of relationship, new forms of church.